In 1968, a construction crew digging on private land in southwestern Montana accidentally overturned a burial that had been sitting undisturbed for roughly 12,600 years. Inside, it was a toddler, somewhere between 12 and 18 months old when he died, buried with an extraordinary collection of stone knives, spear points, and elk bone tools coated in red ochre. Archaeologists immediately recognized the artifacts as belonging to the Clovis culture, the oldest widely recognized tool-making tradition in North America. What they didn't know, and couldn't have known at the time, was that this single child's skeleton would eventually become the centerpiece of one of the most consequential DNA studies ever run on the ancient history of the Americas, a study that would settle debates anthropologists had been fighting over for the better part of a century, and reopen a few new ones in the process. For decades, the question of where Native Americans actually came from when they arrived, and how many separate waves of migration it took to populate two entire continents, had been argued over almost entirely on the basis of stone tools, skull shapes, and educated guesswork. Indigenous oral traditions across the Americas have long described their own peoples as having always been present on this land, entirely independent of any outside migration story. Meanwhile, outside archaeologists and anthropologists spent generations constructing competing scientific models, some of which contradicted each other so sharply that the field remained genuinely unsettled well into the 21st century. Then ancient DNA sequencing technology finally caught up to the question, and in the space of about a decade, the genetic record did something remarkable. It confirmed some of the oldest scientific migration models almost exactly as proposed, demolished at least one major competing theory outright, and revealed an entirely new lost population nobody had previously known existed. It's worth remembering just how contentious this field was before ancient genomes entered the picture. Rival camps of archaeologists spent much of the 20th century arguing over which stone tool traditions were oldest, which skull shapes indicated which ancestral population, and whether the earliest Americans arrived in one single wave or several. Entire academic careers were built defending one migration model against another, sometimes with real professional and personal animosity involved. DNA didn't just add another data point to those debates. In several key cases, it simply ended them in ways that left little room for further argument once the sequences were in hand. The foundation of modern scientific understanding rests on a landmass that doesn't exist anymore in any visible form. During the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea levels dropped low enough to expose a vast stretch of land connecting what is now easternmost Siberia to Alaska. Geologists call this now submerged region Beringia, and for a very long time, the standard assumption was that ancient humans simply walked across it in one relatively brief migration event before spreading south to populate the rest of the hemisphere. Genetics has substantially complicated and substantially confirmed that basic picture at the same time. DNA evidence indicates that the ancestors of Native Americans genetically split off from their Siberian and East Asian relatives somewhere in the range of 25,000 years ago, likely around the time this founding population first entered the Beringian landmass. But rather than crossing straight through in one continuous migration, the genetic evidence points to something scientists now call the Beringian standstill, a period lasting many thousands of years, during which this founding population appears to have remained largely isolated within Beringia itself, neither continuing forward into the Americas nor returning back into Siberia. Cut off from both surrounding regions, this population accumulated its own distinct genetic mutations during that stretch of isolation. Mutations that show up almost universally across indigenous peoples throughout North and South America today, encoded in a specific recognizable set of mitochondrial DNA haplogroups labeled A, B, C, D, and X, along with a Y chromosome haplogroup known as Q. Only after this long standstill period does the genetic record show the population beginning to move again, splitting into at least two major branches. One group appears to have remained behind in the Beringian region itself, eventually becoming what researchers now call the ancient Beringians, a genetically distinct population identified for the first time through the sequencing of an infant's remains found at Alaska's Upward Sun River site, Thumboy. A baby girl who lived and died roughly 11,500 years ago, given the name Zachiti Anen Tiede Gai, meaning sunrise child girl, in the local Athabascan language. Her genome turned out to represent a population genetically separate from, though clearly related to, the ancestors of every other Native American group tested, a population that had apparently split off and stayed put in the north, while the rest of the founding group continued moving south. That other branch, the one that kept moving, eventually gave rise to the Clovis culture, and this is where the Montana toddler comes back into the story. For decades, archaeologists had debated a genuinely contentious question. Were the Clovis people, whose distinctive fluted spear points have been found scattered across dozens of sites throughout North America, the direct biological ancestors of later Native American populations, or were they simply one early culture among several unrelated groups later replaced or absorbed by other migrations? The genome sequenced from that Montana burial, now referred to in the scientific literature as Anzic-1, after the family whose land it was discovered on, provided what researchers have since described as a decisive answer. His DNA confirmed direct genetic ancestry, connecting the Clovis population to a substantial share of modern indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, effectively settling a debate that had run for generations on artifacts and dating estimates alone. Later research pushed the picture even further, comparing Anzic-1's genome against other ancient remains scattered thousands of miles apart. A man buried at Spirit Cave in Nevada roughly 10,700 years ago, and a set of individuals from the Lagoa Santa site in Brazil, dated to somewhere between 10,400 and 9,800 years ago. Researchers found all of them closely genetically related to one another, despite representing sites separated by roughly 6,000 miles. The genetic data suggests that between about 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, the ancestors of Central and South American populations split away from populations further north and moved rapidly southward, most likely following the Pacific coastline rather than cutting through the continental interior. The coastal route was open and passable roughly 16,000 years ago, well before the alternative inland corridor between the retreating ice sheets became viable for travel. Put together, the picture that emerges is one of remarkably fast movement once the standstill period finally ended. Populations related to the Anzic child spread across the full length of both American continents in a matter of a few thousand years, a pace of expansion that surprised even the researchers running the comparisons. Not every piece of this story unfolded smoothly in a lab. In 1996, a skull and partial skeleton were discovered along the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Early cranial analysis of what became known as Kennewick man suggested a set of facial and skull features that didn't closely match modern Native American populations, instead appearing to resemble the Ainu people of Japan, Polynesian populations, or, according to some analyses, showing traits described as European-like. That finding set off a genuinely bitter, decades-long legal and scientific dispute. Several Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest, invoking federal repatriation law, sought to have the roughly 8,500-year-old remains returned for reburial as an ancestor. A group of scientists sued instead for the right to continue studying the skeleton, arguing that the unusual cranial measurements suggested Kennewick man might not be ancestral to any modern Native American population at all, potentially representing an entirely separate non-native migration into ancient North America. The dispute dragged on for the better part of 2 decades, fueled in part by researchers and commentators who used Kennewick Man's unusual skull shape to support a much broader and more controversial idea known as the Solutrean hypothesis. The claim that some portion of the earliest American population might have crossed the Atlantic directly from Ice Age Europe based on perceived similarities between certain ancient European stone tool traditions and early American ones, rather than migrating exclusively from Siberia via Beringia. The legal fight over Kennewick Man's remains became one of the most closely watched cases in American archaeology. A group of scientists sued the federal government for the right to continue examining the skeleton after officials initially sided with the tribes seeking repatriation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Federal courts eventually allowed the continued study to proceed, and a 2014 round of analysis based on isotopic testing, anatomical measurements, and detailed skull morphometrics concluded that Kennewick Man's skeleton most closely resembled circum-Pacific populations, particularly the Ainu people of Japan and various Polynesian groups, while also noting certain features described in the literature as European-like, reinforcing, at least on the surface, the idea that he might represent a population genetically distinct from modern Native Americans. Crucially, that 2014 analysis was based entirely on bone measurements and isotopes. It did not include any DNA sequencing at all, which left the door open for one final, more definitive round of testing. Genetics finally settled the Kennewick Man question in 2015 when a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen successfully sequenced his genome and compared it against genetic data from populations around the world, including the Ainu and various Polynesian groups the cranial analysis had pointed toward. The result was unambiguous. Willerslev put it plainly: comparing Kennewick Man's genome against contemporary populations worldwide clearly showed that Native Americans of today are his closest living relatives, not the Ainu, not Polynesians, and not any European population. Researchers even obtained DNA from one of the claimant tribes, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, and found genuine close genetic affinity, though the study concluded the shared ancestor connecting Kennewick Man specifically to the Colville tribe likely lived somewhere between 600 and 700 years before Kennewick Man's own death, suggesting he wasn't a direct linear ancestor of that particular tribe, but was clearly part of the same broader ancestral Native American population. The skeleton was repatriated and reburied not long after. That same genomic study delivered a second, quieter verdict along the way. The broader Solutrean hypothesis, which some commentators had used Kennewick Man's cranial shape to support, found no genetic backing whatsoever. Ancient genomes from across the Americas, including Kennewick Man's own, consistently traced back to Siberian and East Asian source populations, with no detectable signal of direct Ice Age European ancestry contributing to the founding American gene pool. Even other skeletal remains once thought, on the basis of skull shape alone, to represent a relict population related to Australian or Melanesian groups, including the so-called Fuego Patagonians at the southern tip of South America, turned out, once their DNA was actually sequenced, to be genetically continuous with the same broader Native American ancestral population as everyone else. The broader lesson researchers drew from the Kennewick Man episode extended well beyond this one skeleton. It became a cautionary case study in the limits of skull shape analysis on its own, without genetic confirmation. Cranial morphology can be influenced by nutrition, disease, and simple population-level variation over time in ways that don't necessarily track cleanly with ancestry, and the field has since become considerably more cautious about drawing sweeping migration conclusions from bone measurements alone when ancient DNA sequencing is a technical possibility. Villerslev and his colleagues noted after the study that the specific combination of traits that had once seemed to point toward Ainu or Polynesian ancestry likely reflected natural variation within the broader ancestral Native American population itself, rather than evidence of a separate migration event, a conclusion made possible only once the genome itself was finally available for direct comparison. While American ancient DNA studies were resolving Clovis ancestry and settling the Kennewick Man dispute, a separate line of research was working the other end of the migration route, deep in Siberia, trying to pin down exactly which ancient population on the Asian side of Beringia actually gave rise to the founders of the Americas. That search led to one of the more unusual sample sources in the entire field. 2 31,000-year-old baby teeth recovered from an archaeological site along Siberia's Yana River, representing the oldest human genetic material ever recovered from the region. Villerslev's team sequenced genomes from 34 individuals who had lived across Siberia, Beringia, and Alaska over a span running from roughly 600 to more than 31,000 years ago, comparing all of them against modern Native American genetic data in an effort to trace the specific ancient Siberian lineage most closely connected to the eventual founders of the Americas. The resulting picture, published in 2 companion Nature papers, reinforced the broader standstill model while adding real nuance. The ancestors of Native Americans appear to descend from a genetic blend that formed when ancient Upper Paleolithic populations already present in northern Eurasia mixed with newer arrivals moving in from East Asia, a mixed population that was already established in the Beringian Refuge well before the last glacial maximum locked much of the region under ice. The Beringian standstill model has continued picking up additional support and additional complexity from newer discoveries. A 2015 study examining the remains of an infant and a preterm fetus buried together at a central Alaska site roughly 11,500 years ago found something researchers hadn't anticipated. The 2 children carried mitochondrial haplogroups, C1b and B2, that are rare or entirely absent among contemporary native populations living in that same region today. The finding indicated real, substantial genetic diversity present within the founding Beringian population, diversity considerably richer than what survived and spread into the populations we can study today. Consistent with the Beringian standstill hypothesis's prediction that a large, stable, genetically varied population lived in the region for a very long stretch of time before dispersing. That kind of discovery is a useful reminder of how incomplete the genetic record still is, even after 2 decades of intensive ancient DNA research. Only a small handful of burials from this critical early period have ever been found in a state well preserved enough to yield usable genetic material, and each new one tends to reveal genetic variation that simply isn't visible anywhere in modern populations. Lineages that either died out entirely or became so diluted over the following 10,000 years that they're effectively invisible without directly sequencing the ancient bones themselves. Every additional ancient genome researchers manage to recover pushes the picture a little further from a single tidy migration story and a little closer to something messier and more interesting. A large, genetically diverse founding population that took thousands of years to fully unpack itself across 2 continents, with plenty of genetic branches along the way that simply didn't survive into the present day. It would be easy to treat all of this purely as a technical dispute among specialists, but the human stakes attached to these findings have been real and, at times, deeply felt. The Kennewick Man case in particular became a flashpoint precisely because early scientific claims about his ancestry were used by some to argue against tribal repatriation claims and, more broadly, to suggest that the earliest inhabitants of North America might not have been ancestral to modern native peoples at all, a claim with obvious and troubling implications for indigenous land and identity claims, regardless of the scientific merit behind it. The eventual genetic verdict, confirming close kinship between Kennewick Man and living Native American communities, carried real weight for the tribes who had spent 2 decades fighting for recognition of that relationship, and it directly enabled the ceremonial reburial they had sought from the very beginning. Similarly, when the Anzac child's genome was published in 2014, it eventually led to a repatriation and reburial ceremony conducted with representatives from multiple tribes, an event participants described as an act of healing bridging scientific discovery and living cultural tradition. A reminder that behind every genetic data point in these studies sits an actual human being who was once loved, mourned, and buried with real ceremony. In the Anzac child's case, surrounded by carefully placed red ochre and finely crafted tools clearly meant to accompany him into whatever his community understood came next. None of this genetic work has closed every open question. Researchers still debate the exact timing of the earliest human entry into the Americas, with some archaeological sites, a handful of contested footprint and sediment finds, hinting at a human presence that may predate the standard Beringian standstill timeline considerably, sparking ongoing arguments about whether earlier, smaller migration pulses might have preceded the larger Clovis-associated expansion. The genetic relationship between the ancient Beringian population and later southward moving groups remains an area of active research, as does the precise number and timing of subsequent smaller migration waves that occurred after the initial peopling of the continents, some of which appear to have introduced additional genetic input into far northern populations long after the main dispersal was already complete. Researchers have also had to grapple in recent years with an entirely different kind of question, not just what the DNA shows, but who gets to decide whether it should be studied at all. Many indigenous communities have understandably complicated relationships with ancient DNA research, given a long history of remains being excavated, studied, and displayed without consent, often against explicit community objections. The more recent wave of studies, including the Anzac child's genome and much of the subsequent Beringian research, has increasingly involved direct collaboration and consultation with tribal governments and communities, a shift that reflects lessons learned from the decades-long Kennewick Man dispute as much as it reflects any purely scientific advance. What the accumulated genetic evidence has done, decisively, is rule out several once serious alternative theories. The Solitrean hypothesis of direct Ice Age European ancestry has found no genetic support in any ancient American genome sequenced so far. Claims that certain ancient American skeletal remains represented entirely separate, non-native migrations unrelated to modern indigenous peoples have likewise been directly contradicted by DNA evidence in every tested case, including the 2 most prominent examples, Kennewick Man and the Fuego Patagonian remains, that had once seemed to support exactly that idea based on skull shape alone. What makes the Native American case genuinely distinctive, set against other ancient ancestry mysteries tested through modern genetics, is the sheer scale and speed of what the DNA record reveals. This wasn't a small community's oral tradition being checked against a single genetic marker. It was 2 entire continents' worth of ancient human history, spanning tens of thousands of years and thousands of individual archaeological sites, gradually pieced back together through a relatively small number of extraordinarily well-preserved ancient genomes. A Montana toddler, a Nevada hunter, a group of individuals from central Brazil, an Alaskan infant, a contested Columbia River skeleton, and a pair of Siberian baby teeth older than almost any other human DNA ever recovered. Each new genome added another data point to a migration story that stone tools and skull measurements alone had never been able to fully resolve. and each new finding has tended to reinforce the same basic outline. A single founding population, isolated for millennia in a land bridge that no longer exists, before splitting apart and spreading across 2 continents faster than almost anyone studying the physical evidence alone had ever suspected. Taken together, the Anzic child, Kenewick man, the Alaskan infants, us and the ancient Siberian baby teeth form a chain of evidence stretching across more than 30,000 years of human history, a chain built not from any single spectacular discovery, but from the slow, patient accumulation of ancient genomes, one burial at a time, each one adding a little more certainty to a story that used to rest almost entirely on guesswork. If a story like this, where ancient bones and modern DNA sequencing quietly settle debates that stone tools and skull shapes argued over for a century, is the kind that stays with you, stick around, because there are very few places in population genetics where the evidence keeps arriving this steadily and keeps rewriting the map every few years. And if there's a specific ancient migration, lost population, or ancestry mystery you've always wanted properly examined against the actual evidence, drop it in the comments, because that's exactly where the next story like this one tends to come from.